think clearly when others panic. There is a moment in every crisis when most people stop thinking, not because they lack intelligence, not because the problem is too complex, because the pressure arrives and the thinking machine goes offline. What replaces it is faster and louder and almost always wrong. You have been in this moment. Everyone has. The conversation that accelerated past the point where you were choosing your words. The decision made in urgency that you spent the next week reversing. The situation where something was clearly happening, and your mind, instead of observing it precisely, started running hot, narrating, catastrophizing, seeking the exit rather than the answer. The people around you in that moment were probably doing the same thing. Panic moves through groups faster than information does. One person's activated state triggers the next person's threat response. And within a short time, a room full of individually capable people is producing collectively poor thinking. Not because any of them lack the capacity for better, but because the conditions have conspired to make better thinking unavailable. Except for one or two people. You have noticed them. The person who, in the middle of the chaos, is still watching rather than reacting, who speaks less, but whose words land differently, who seems to be receiving more information from the situation than everyone else, not because they have special access to facts, but because their mind is still processing rather than merely responding. That quality is not a gift. It is a trained capacity. And it is the specific capacity this audiobook builds. Clear thinking under pressure is not about eliminating emotion or achieving a state of cold detachment. It is about maintaining the specific cognitive functions that pressure tends to shut down. The observation before action, the question before conclusion, the space between stimulus and response, where genuine strategy lives. 10 chapters, each one building a layer of the architecture. By the end, you will understand not just what clear thinking under pressure looks like from the outside, but what generates it from the inside, and what specific practices, applied consistently in the ordinary moments of daily life, make it available in the extraordinary moments that test everyone. When the pressure rises and others panic, you think. That distinction determines outcomes. Begin. Introduction. The rarest advantage. In most competitive environments, professional, social, financial, the participants have broadly similar information available. They are operating from the same basic facts, the same general awareness of what is happening, the same access to the inputs from which decisions must be made. What separates their outcomes is not primarily the quality of their information. It is the quality of their processing under pressure. The person who can receive the same information as everyone else in a high-stakes moment and produce a clearer analysis, a more accurate assessment of what is actually happening versus what merely appears to be happening, and a more considered response to what a situation requires, that person will, across most conditions and most situations, produce better outcomes than the person whose processing is degraded by the activation the pressure produces. This is the rarest advantage. Rare not because it is inaccessible, but because it requires something that most people have never deliberately built: the specific capacity to maintain cognitive quality under the conditions that most reliably degrade it. Pressure degrades cognition through specific mechanisms. It narrows the range of information the mind attends to. It shortens the time horizon over which consequences are evaluated. It increases the salience of the fast, emotionally driven response relative to the slow, deliberate one. It makes the familiar and the default more appealing than the novel and the considered. These are not random failures. They are the predictable outputs of a system that evolved for speed in conditions of genuine threat. A system that is fast and effective in the situations it was designed for, and systematically unreliable in the complex, ambiguous situations that modern life most frequently presents. Understanding these mechanisms is the first step in building the capacity to override them, not to disable the fast system, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but to maintain access to the deliberate system alongside the fast one, even under the conditions that push most people entirely into the fast mode. The 10 chapters ahead are organized around the specific challenges that pressure presents to clear thinking and the specific capacities that address those challenges. They build on each other. The understanding in each chapter is the foundation for the practice in the next. The audiobook you're about to hear is not primarily about crisis management or high-stakes decision-making in the narrow professional sense. Those are included, but they are expressions of something more fundamental: the general capacity for deliberate thinking in any situation where the pressure to react quickly is competing with the value of thinking carefully. That competition happens dozens of times every day. The capacity built in these chapters is the advantage in every one of them. Chapter 1. Why most people think worse under pressure. When pressure rises, most people stop thinking. They start reacting. This is not a moral observation. It is a description of a physiological process that operates in nearly every human being under conditions of sufficient stress or threat. Understanding it precisely, not as a vague claim about how people behave badly under pressure, but as a specific account of what happens in the brain and body when the stress response activates, is the foundation for everything that follows. The human brain operates through two broad processing modes that work in parallel but are not equally available under all conditions. The first mode is fast, automatic, and largely unconscious. It operates through pattern recognition, rapidly matching the current situation to stored patterns from prior experience and generating an immediate response based on that match. This system is extraordinarily efficient. It processes enormous amounts of information with minimal effort, produces responses with minimal delay, and in familiar situations produces results that are reliable enough that the deliberate system's involvement would add cost without adding value. The second mode is slow, deliberate, and effortful. It operates through analysis. examining the current situation step by step, checking assumptions, weighing alternatives, evaluating consequences across longer time horizons. This system is more accurate than the fast system in genuinely novel, complex, or high-stakes situations. It is also more expensive. It consumes more cognitive resource, takes more time, and requires the kind of mental capacity that is the first thing the stress response degrades. Stress shuts down rational thinking through a specific mechanism. It triggers a cascade of physiological changes that prioritize the fast system at the expense of the slow one. When the stress response activates, in response to a perceived threat, whether physical, social, or merely imagined, the body mobilizes for rapid response. The resources available to the brain shift in the direction that supports the fast mode. The prefrontal cortex, which is the neural substrate of the slow, deliberate processing mode, receives relatively less support. The emotional processing centers, which drive the fast pattern matching mode, become relatively more dominant. The result is that the person under acute stress is literally less capable of the deliberate analysis that complex situations require. The thinking machine is not offline. It is simply less resourced, less capable of producing the quality of output that it would produce under lower stress conditions. The person is not less intelligent. They are operating with a temporarily reduced version of their deliberate cognitive capacity. This reduction is invisible to the person experiencing it. From the inside, under stress, the thinking feels normal. The person is not aware that they are analyzing less carefully, considering fewer alternatives, evaluating consequences across a shorter time horizon. The fast system produces its output with the same phenomenological quality of certainty and completeness that well-considered deliberate analysis would produce. The feeling of having thought the thing through is present even when the thinking that actually occurred was largely the product of the pattern-matching system rather than the analytical one. The distinction between emotional reactions and strategic responses is the operational expression of this two-system architecture. An emotional reaction is the behavioral output of the fast system operating in the dominance mode that stress produces. It is fast, it is driven by the emotional content of the situation, it matches the situation to the most emotionally salient stored pattern and executes the response that pattern specifies. It feels appropriate, it feels necessary, and it is often wrong in ways that are only visible after the activation has reduced and the slow system has regained enough access to evaluate what occurred. A strategic response is the behavioral output of the deliberate system maintaining enough access to participate in what happens next. It is slower. It involves the specific practices described throughout this audiobook: the pause, the observation before action, the question before conclusion. It is frequently less satisfying in the immediate moment than the emotional reaction, less cathartic, less decisive feeling, less expressive of the urgency the activated state is generating, and it is typically more accurate, more aligned with the genuine requirements of the situation, and better for the outcome. The distance between these two modes is not a moral distance. It is not the distance between emotional weakness and rational strength. It is the distance between an automatic process and a deliberate one, between what the system produces when left to its defaults and what it produces when those defaults are overridden by the specific capacity for maintaining deliberate access under pressure. Why panic spreads through groups deserves its own examination because it adds a social dimension to what otherwise sounds like an individual cognitive challenge. The social dimension is real and consequential. The stress response is contagious through the social neural architecture that connects human beings to each other's emotional states. When one person is in a state of high activation, visibly anxious, moving quickly, speaking in the compressed tones of urgency, the social brains of the people around them register the signals and begin to generate a partial matching activation. The threat that one person is responding to becomes a threat for the group, even if no individual in the group has independently assessed the situation as threatening. This contagion is fast. It runs through the same automatic pathway as all threat responses, below the threshold of conscious awareness, before the deliberate system has any opportunity to evaluate whether the contagion is warranted. The room fills with activated nervous systems before anyone has asked whether the activation is appropriate to the actual situation. The person who can maintain deliberate access in this environment is doing something rare and consequential. They are providing a competing signal. Their regulated state, their measured pace, their evident lack of activation, all of this is received by the social brains of the people around them as information. The information says, someone here has assessed this situation and has not concluded that panic is warranted. That information has a moderating effect on the group's collective activation, even before the person has said or done anything explicitly. This is the first and most fundamental reason why clear thinking under pressure is not merely a personal advantage. It is a social one. The person who thinks clearly when others panic does not benefit only from the quality of their own processing. They change the conditions for everyone around them. The chapters that follow build the specific capacities that make this possible. Chapter 2. The Hidden Power of Slowing Down. The most dangerous decision is the one made too quickly. Speed in decision-making carries a powerful cultural mythology. The fast decision-maker is confident, decisive, capable. The person who pauses, who asks questions before committing, who wants more time before choosing. These behaviors are often read as hesitation, as uncertainty, as the absence of the leadership quality that is supposed to produce immediate, authoritative responses to challenging situations. This mythology has enough surface truth in enough narrow contexts to feel credible. There are situations where speed is genuinely necessary, where the cost of delay is higher than the cost of acting on incomplete information. Military situations, genuine physical emergencies, certain time-sensitive financial decisions. In these contexts, the capacity for fast, committed action on the best available information is genuinely valuable. The problem is that most situations described or experienced as requiring immediate decision are not actually in this category. The urgency is felt rather than real. It is a product of the activated state producing the sense that something must be done now, that the window for action is closing, that delay equals loss. This sense is the fast system's output, calibrated for environments where delay often was costly. Applied to the complex social, professional, and personal situations that most people navigate most of the time, it produces the wrong calibration. It treats situations that could accommodate deliberation as though they require the response speed of genuine emergencies. Why does the brain love fast reactions? The explanation lies in the economy of cognitive effort. The fast system is cheap. It produces its outputs with minimal deliberate effort. The pattern is recognized, the response is generated, the action is initiated, all without the metabolic expense of sustained, deliberate analysis. The slow system is expensive. It requires focused attention, working memory resources, and the kind of effort that depletes the deliberate processing capacity over time. Under any condition where the fast system's output is good enough, the slow system represents unnecessary expenditure. The fast system is also rewarding. The experience of acting decisively, of receiving a stimulus and producing a rapid, confident response, carries a specific quality of satisfaction that the slow, deliberate process does not. The fast response feels right in a way that the careful response does not, precisely because the fast system's output arrives with the phenomenological quality of certainty that deliberate analysis by its nature often cannot provide. These two features, the low cost and the rewarding quality of fast responses, create a strong pull toward the fast mode that is independent of whether the fast mode is producing the right outputs for the current situation. The brain's preference for speed is not irrational in the design sense. It becomes problematic when the environments encountered are sufficiently different from those it was designed for that the calibration no longer serves. How calm thinkers create space to think is the operational question this chapter is ultimately addressing. The space to think, the gap between the triggering stimulus and the committed response, is not something that circumstances provide automatically. In most high-pressure situations, circumstances produce the opposite. The social pressure of others' expectations, the urgency of the activated state, the forward momentum of events already in motion, all of these conspire to narrow the gap and accelerate the progression from stimulus to response. The space must be deliberately created against the pressure of everything pushing toward immediate action. The calm thinker creates this space through a combination of internal regulation and external behavior. Internally, the regulation practices described throughout this audiobook, the breath management, the early recognition of escalation, the micro-pause, maintain enough access to the deliberate processing system to make the space viable. The space is not just created, it is used. A space in which the fast system is still running unchecked is not deliberation. It is merely delayed reaction. Externally, the calm thinker signals to the social environment that the space is being created. The deliberate slowing of speech rate, the explicit statement that the situation warrants consideration before response, the comfortable tolerance of silence rather than the urgency-driven filling of every conversational gap. These signals serve two purposes. They communicate to others that the person is processing rather than failing to respond, which reduces the social pressure toward immediate engagement. And they create a slight moderating effect on the group's overall pace. The deliberate space taken by one person gives others permission to take a similar space rather than matching the urgency that the activation of the most activated person in the room is generating. The power of the pause is real and specific, and it deserves direct examination because it is the most practically available tool for introducing deliberate processing into situations that are pushing strongly toward the fast mode. The pause works because of what happens in the brain during even a brief period of non-action following a trigger. The neurochemical cascade of the stress response peaks quickly and then begins to diminish. The deliberate system, which was relatively disadvantaged at the peak, regains a small degree of access as the peak reduces. This partial recovery is what makes the pause productive. It does not restore full deliberate capacity. But even partial restoration of deliberate capacity changes the quality of the analysis and the response. The pause can be external, a literal silence, a moment of physical stillness, or internal, while external activity continues. The internal pause is the more demanding and the more generally applicable. The deliberate direction of attention toward the question of what is actually happening before committing to a course of action about what to do about it. This is observation before analysis, and analysis before response. The specific sequence that clear thinking under pressure requires and that the activation of the stress response disrupts. The pause is not hesitation. It is the insertion of intelligence into a process that, without it, would proceed entirely on pattern matching. It is the beginning of the strategic advantage this audiobook is building toward. Chapter 3. Emotional Noise. Often the problem is not the situation. It is the noise inside your head about the situation. Every situation you encounter arrives embedded in a layer of interpretation. Not just the situation itself, the facts, the actual state of affairs, but the meaning you are assigning to those facts, the narrative you are constructing about what they imply, the emotional response that narrative generates, and the further interpretation that emotional response produces. By the time you are responding to a situation, you are typically responding to several layers of processed experience rather than to the situation itself. Under normal conditions, this layering happens quickly and largely without awareness. The situation arrives, the processing occurs, the response follows, and the processing layer, invisible, shapes the response in ways that may or may not accurately reflect what the situation actually required. Under pressure, this layering becomes louder and more distorting. The emotional component of the processing increases. The narrative becomes more dramatic. The interpretation moves further from the facts and closer to the fears. The distance between what is actually happening and what the mind is generating about what is happening increases, and the response, built on that generated content rather than on the actual situation, increasingly reflects the noise rather than the signal. Fear distorts perception in ways that are specific and predictable. The first distortion is attentional. Fear directs attention toward threat-confirming information and away from threat-disconfirming information. The person who is frightened in a situation will attend disproportionately to the elements of the situation that confirm the fear and will underweight or fail to notice the elements that would moderate it. This is not a choice. It is the automatic consequence of the threat orientation that fear produces. The result is an information base that is systematically biased toward the feared outcome, which produces an analysis that overestimates its probability. The second distortion is interpretive. Fear makes ambiguous signals more threatening. The message that could be read as critical or as constructive is read as critical when the emotional state is fearful. The silence that could be neutral or hostile is read as hostile. Every ambiguous element of the situation is resolved in the direction that the fear is already pointing. The third distortion is temporal. Fear compresses the time horizon over which consequences are evaluated. The feared bad outcome, which may be distant or uncertain, feels immediate and certain in the emotional state. The longer horizon perspective that would allow a more accurate probability assessment is less available because the attention has been captured by the near-term emotional representation of the threat. These three distortions working together produce a specific kind of error, the catastrophizing that treats possible negative outcomes as probable or certain, that reads neutral or ambiguous information as confirming the worst, and that generates responses calibrated to the imagined worst case rather than the actual situation. The illusion of urgency is the emotional noise phenomenon that most directly degrades the quality of decision-making under pressure. Urgency, the felt sense that something must be done immediately, that delay is dangerous, that the window for correct action is closing, is a genuine signal in some situations. When it is genuine, it calibrates the speed of response appropriately to the speed of the situation. The problem is that urgency is also generated by the emotional state itself, independent of whether the situation actually requires rapid response. The activated person experiences urgency as a perception of the situation. It feels like accurate information about the time constraints involved. But much of what is felt as urgency in emotionally activated states is the emotional activation's own contribution, the nervous system's mobilization for rapid action expressing itself as the felt sense that rapid action is required. The urgency is in the nervous system, not in the situation. This illusory urgency is one of the most costly producers of poor decisions under pressure. It creates false time pressure that forecloses the deliberation that the situation could accommodate, that produces commitments to courses of action before the analysis is complete, that translates the need to do something into an action without the intermediate step of verifying that this specific something is what the situation actually requires. Separating signal from noise is the core practice of this chapter, and it is worth describing in precise terms because the practice is not as simple as merely deciding to stop being distracted by the emotional layer. The signal is the actual information the situation contains, what is factually happening, what is known with reasonable certainty, what is genuinely uncertain, what the relevant time constraints are, what options are actually available. The noise is everything else, the narrative, the interpretation, the emotional amplification, the catastrophic projection, the illusory urgency, the imagined implications that are not yet facts. Separating them requires a specific interrogative practice. When the activated state produces a strong signal about the situation, this is an emergency. This person is hostile. This decision must be made now. This outcome is likely. The practice is to pause and ask the simple question, what do I actually know, versus what am I generating about what is happening? This question is not the dismissal of the emotional input. Fear sometimes contains genuine information. Urgency is sometimes warranted. The question is the check on whether the emotional layer is tracking the actual situation or has departed from it, whether the signal and the noise are currently distinguishable. In the space that the question creates, the actual facts become more visible. The noise, which is often vivid and compelling in the activated state, becomes more identifiable as noise rather than being absorbed into the assessment of the situation itself. That separation is not perfect. It is never complete in the heat of a pressured moment, but a partial separation, a reduction of the noise's influence on the analysis, produces meaningfully better thinking than the unexamined acceptance of everything the activated state is generating as accurate information about the world. Chapter 4. Strategic Thinking in Chaos. While others react, strategists observe. The word strategist carries connotations of formal planning, organizational hierarchy, deliberate long-term calculation. None of those connotations are what this chapter is about. Strategic thinking, in the sense relevant here, is simply the practice of maintaining a perspective that is wider than the immediate moment, of refusing to allow the current activation to be the entire frame for understanding the situation. The reactive person is entirely inside the current moment. Their attention is captured by what is happening now, what has just been said, what they are currently feeling about it. The perspective available to them extends as far as the immediate situation allows, and no further. They respond to this moment as though it were the entire picture. The strategic thinker is in the current moment and simultaneously slightly outside it. They are attending to what is happening now, but also to what the current moment is an instance of, to the pattern the current situation is part of, to the trajectory the current exchange is on, to what this moment is likely to produce and what would need to happen instead. This dual perspective, inside the moment and observing it simultaneously, is what strategic thinking actually consists of. Thinking 3 moves ahead is the popularized version of this principle, and it is worth unpacking because it is often misunderstood as a call for elaborate long-term calculation that is not available under pressure. 3 moves ahead does not mean predicting with precision what will happen across a long sequence of future events. In complex situations, that kind of prediction is largely impossible. What it means is extending the analysis beyond the immediate response to include at least a brief consideration of what the immediate response is likely to produce, and whether that consequence is what the situation actually requires. The first move is what you are about to do. The second move is what that action is likely to produce in the situation, how others are likely to respond, what conditions it will create, how it will change the state of the exchange or the problem. The third move is whether those likely consequences serve your actual purpose, the real goal behind the immediate desire to act. This 3-level analysis does not require extended deliberation. With practice, it becomes rapid. The question becomes almost automatic. What will this produce, and is that what I actually want? The practice of asking it, even quickly, even approximately, introduces the future orientation that the activated state strips out. Most reactive behavior fails the 3-move test easily. The sharp reply that satisfies the immediate emotional demand produces a defensive escalation that damages the relationship it was already testing. The decision made to relieve the urgency produces a commitment that the situation did not require, and that subsequent calmer analysis would not have made. The action taken to demonstrate decisiveness moves the situation in a direction that makes the actual goal less accessible. Reading the situation before acting is the observational component of strategic thinking, the specific discipline of acquiring a more complete and accurate picture of what is actually happening before committing to a course of action. Most people begin acting before this picture is complete. The fast system identifies the trigger, recognizes a pattern, and generates a response before the full observation of the situation has occurred. The response is built on a partial picture. The elements the fast system identified as relevant without the elements that a more complete observation would have added. The deliberate practice of reading the situation means explicitly delaying action until a more complete observation has been made. What is actually happening here? What do I know and what am I assuming? Who are the relevant people, and what is each of them trying to accomplish? What is the most important element of this situation? Not the most emotionally activating, but the most consequential for what happens next. This reading is not passive. It is active, directed, purposeful. It is the gathering of the inputs that strategic response requires, conducted before the strategic response is formed rather than after it. Why calm observation wins is the question that ties this chapter's insights together. The calm observer is not winning because they are less engaged or less invested. They are often more genuinely invested in the outcome than the reactive person, who is primarily invested in the relief of the activated state, rather than in the achievement of the actual goal. The calm observer wins because they are working with a more complete and more accurate picture of what is happening. The reactive person is responding to their interpretation of the situation, the fast system output, modified by the distortions of emotional noise, accelerated by illusory urgency. The calm observer is responding to the situation itself, the actual state of affairs, as completely perceived as the circumstances allow. These two inputs produce different responses, and in the situations that matter most, the high-stakes decisions, the conflict with real consequences, the moments where the choice between reactive and strategic will determine the outcome. The difference in the quality of the input produces a real difference in the quality of the result. The calm observer sees more, seeing more. They do better. Chapter 5. The Calm Advantage. Calm is not weakness, it is control over the situation. The misreading of calm as weakness is one of the most costly conceptual errors in how people understand power and effectiveness. It arises from a confusion between the presence of visible activation and the presence of genuine engagement. The assumption is that intensity signals investment, that the person who is visibly activated, who raises their voice, who moves quickly and speaks urgently, is more seriously engaged with the situation than the person who remains composed. This assumption is wrong in most cases. The intensely activated person is not more invested in the outcome. They are more invested in the relief of their current emotional state. The urgency, the raised voice, the visible engagement, these are primarily the behavioral outputs of the stress response, not the expressions of considered commitment to a goal. They feel decisive. They feel powerful. Their relationship to the actual outcome is frequently adversarial, because the stress response degrades the quality of the thinking that good outcomes require. The calm person's investment in the outcome is not expressed through visible activation. It is expressed through the quality of their observation, the deliberateness of their analysis, the consideration of their response. The investment is real, often more real than the activated person's, because it is not competing with the emotional state management that the activation requires. All of the cognitive resource is available for the problem. Calm body, calm thinking is not a metaphor. It is a description of the physiological relationship between bodily state and cognitive function. The bodily state of high activation, elevated heart rate, increased muscle tension, the physical mobilization of the stress response, is not the bodily state of high cognitive function. The resources that have been mobilized for physical response have been partially redirected from the deliberate processing functions. The body is ready for action, but not for the kind of careful analysis that complex situations require. The calm body, lower heart rate, reduced muscle tension, the regulated physiological state of the parasympathetic nervous system provides the bodily substrate for the quality of cognitive function that clear thinking demands. This is not about being slow or passive. A calm body can act with full effectiveness and appropriate speed when the situation requires it. The difference is that the action is the output of clear analysis, rather than the output of the activated state's demand for immediate response. The practical implication is that the physiological practices for maintaining calm, breath management, physical grounding, the deliberate reduction of the body's activation level are not merely comfort practices. They are cognitive performance practices. The regulation of the body is the regulation of the thinking instrument. Taking care of the instrument directly improves its output. Emotional discipline is the internal practice that the calm advantage requires, not the suppression of emotional experience, but the specific capacity to have the emotional experience without allowing it to dominate the processing. The emotionally disciplined person is feeling. They are registering the emotional content of the situation, the significance of what is at stake, the genuine concern or frustration or urgency that the situation produces. What they are doing with that content is different from the undisciplined person. They are using it as information rather than as instruction. The frustration tells them something important is not working as it should. The anxiety identifies something that warrants careful attention. The urgency signals that the time dimension of the situation deserves consideration. But none of these signals automatically determine the response. They inform the analysis. They contribute to the picture. They do not override the deliberate processing that would produce the most appropriate response to what the situation actually requires. This is emotional discipline, the practiced capacity to receive the emotional signal, to extract the information it contains, and to continue the deliberate analysis that the situation demands, rather than handing the entire process over to the emotional system's preferred response. How leaders stay composed in the most demanding situations is a question worth examining, because it illuminates the practices that this chapter is describing in action. The leaders who maintain composure under the highest levels of pressure share a common set of internal habits. They have a practiced relationship with their own activation. They are familiar with the feeling of being highly activated. They know it as a state they have been in before and returned from. And this familiarity removes the second-order activation that novelty would add. The experienced leader has been here. This feeling is not new. Its presence is not evidence that the situation is catastrophic. They also maintain a consistent orientation toward the question of what is actually happening, rather than allowing the narrative of what might happen to consume the processing resources available. This is the signal versus noise discipline in practice, the deliberate return again and again to what is known versus what is feared, to what the situation actually contains rather than what the activated state is projecting onto it. And they practice consistently in the low-stakes moments that constitute most of ordinary life, the same internal habits they draw on in the high-stakes moments. The composure under pressure is not a special ability deployed only in emergencies. It is the everyday quality of deliberate functioning expressed in the most extreme conditions the everyday practitioner encounters. Composure is not a crisis management tool. It is a daily practice that becomes a crisis management tool. Chapter 6. Seeing what others miss. When the crowd panics, opportunity appears. This is not a cynical observation about capitalizing on others' distress. It is a structural observation about how collective panic changes the information landscape available to people who are not panicking. When most people in a situation are in the reactive mode, attended exclusively to the threat, narrowed in their attentional range, following the herd in their assessments and responses, the information they are not attending to remains available. The person who has maintained deliberate access has access to information that the panicking crowd has systematically excluded from their field of awareness. This information asymmetry is real and consequential. It creates advantage in multiple domains. In negotiations where one party has succumbed to urgency and the other has not. In professional situations where most people's threat-narrowed attention has missed important context. In social situations where the dynamics beneath the surface are visible to the observer who has not been consumed by the emotional current that everyone else is navigating. The advantage is not primarily informational in the raw sense. The calm thinker does not have access to more facts than the panicking person. They have access to more of the facts that are available to everyone, because their attentional range has not been narrowed by the threat response. They see the full picture because they are not currently looking only for the threat within it. Opportunity inside chaos is the specific expression of this advantage in high-stakes situations. When situations deteriorate rapidly, markets fall, plans collapse, organizations face crises, the collective response produces a specific pattern of behavior. Most participants contract. They retreat from the uncertain, reduce their exposure to the novel, cling to the familiar. This contraction is individually rational in a narrow sense. It reduces the immediate risk of additional loss. Collectively, it produces conditions that are specifically advantageous for the participant who is not contracting. The contracting crowd creates space. The assets abandoned by the panicking seller are available at prices the panicking seller did not expect to accept. The initiative vacated by the retreating competitor is available for the organization that can still act deliberately. The conversation that everyone else is afraid to have is available for the person who has not been paralyzed by the social threat that the conversation represents. These are opportunities that the panicking participants are not missing because they lack the information that the opportunities exist. They are missing them because they are attending to the threat, not to what the threat has created. The calm thinker's advantage is attentional. They are looking at the whole situation rather than only at the source of the alarm. Strategic perception is the developed capacity to see what others in the same situation are systematically not seeing. It is called strategic because it is not accidental. The panicking person does not accidentally fail to notice the opportunity in the chaos. They fail to notice it through a systematic, predictable process. Threat-directed attention, narrowed peripheral awareness, and the prioritization of the fast system's outputs over the slow systems. Strategic perception is the reverse of this process, maintained deliberately against the pull of the activation that produces it. The development of strategic perception requires a specific practice. The deliberate broadening of attention at the moments when the activated state is most aggressively narrowing it. The question, what else is present here? What am I not attending to because I am attending to the alarm? What would I notice about this situation if the alarm were reduced? This question does not resolve the alarm. It simply creates a brief expansion of the attentional field that allows the wider picture to become visible. In that wider picture, the information that the narrowed attention was excluding becomes available. And in that expanded information base, the elements that constitute the opportunity, the thing the crowd has missed, the element of the situation that its collective panic has made available, can be found. Why pressure reveals patterns is the final insight of this chapter, and it completes the picture of what strategic perception makes available. Pressure reveals patterns because it strips away the deliberate management of appearance and behavior that ordinary conditions support. Under pressure, people become more obviously themselves, more obviously what their characteristic patterns of response actually are, less able to maintain the performed versions of those patterns that lower stakes conditions allow. This revelation is information. The person who is observing a high-pressure situation rather than being consumed by it is receiving information about the genuine character of the people involved, the genuine resilience of the systems under test, the genuine priorities of the organizations facing the crisis that lower pressure conditions would not have provided. The pressure has done the work of revealing what was present but not visible before. The calm observer collects this information because they are observing rather than reacting. The panicking participants are too consumed by their own activation to attend to what the pressure is revealing about the situation. The calm thinker, maintaining deliberate access, can attend to both the immediate demands of the situation and the deeper patterns that the pressure has exposed. Patterns, once seen, can be used. The person who sees them first has the advantage. Chapter 7. The Power of Emotional Distance. You think better when you are not submerged in the emotion of the moment. Emotional distance is frequently misunderstood as a counsel of coldness, the advice to stop caring, to become detached in the sense of being disengaged, to operate from a place where the emotional significance of what is happening no longer registers. This misunderstanding produces two opposite and equally mistaken responses. The people who resist the principle because it seems to require becoming less than fully human, and the people who embrace it and become genuinely closed and inaccessible in ways that limit their effectiveness rather than enhancing it. Neither of these responses is what emotional distance actually means. Emotional distance, in the sense relevant to clear thinking under pressure, is the maintained distinction between what is happening and what you feel about what is happening. The event is real. The emotional response to it is real. The two are not the same thing, and conflating them, treating the emotional response as though it were the event rather than a response to it, is one of the primary mechanisms through which emotional noise distorts the analysis of situations. The distant perspective is not the absence of feeling. It is the observation of the feeling alongside the observation of the situation. The capacity to notice that you are frustrated, to register what that frustration might be signaling, and to continue the analysis of the situation as a phenomenon distinct from your emotional state about it. Detachment as a mental tool is this capacity in its most practical form. The ability to temporarily step back from the immediate emotional experience of a situation to observe it with something closer to the perspective of an outside analyst. The outside analyst, the person who has no personal stake in the outcome, no emotional history with the parties involved, no immediate pressure from the situation, naturally produces clearer analysis than the person who is inside the situation because they are not managing the emotional content while trying to think. Their cognitive resources are fully available for the analysis rather than being partially consumed by the management of personal investment. The detachment practice is the deliberate cultivation of a degree of this outside analyst perspective while remaining inside the situation, not the full detachment of the genuinely outside analyst. Your stake in the outcome and your emotional history with the situation are real and provide important information that the outside analyst lacks. A degree of distance, enough to see the situation as something that can be analyzed rather than only as something that is happening to you. The specific practice is a perspective shift from in this situation to observing this situation, not a permanent shift. You return to full engagement with the situation from the observer perspective rather than abandoning the engagement entirely. A brief movement to the observation position to see from there what the immersed position cannot easily see, and then back to the engaged position to act on what the observation revealed. Thinking beyond personal ego is the most demanding application of emotional distance, because personal ego, the identity investment in the current assessment, the commitment to being right, the self-concept engaged with the outcome, is one of the most powerful sources of the cognitive bias that emotional distance is designed to address. The ego's investment in a particular outcome does not simply weight the analysis toward that outcome. It systematically distorts the information gathering process. It selects the information that confirms the preferred conclusion. It dismisses or minimizes the information that challenges it. It reads ambiguous evidence as supporting the ego's position. It generates motivated explanations for evidence that cannot be ignored. The result is an analysis that feels rigorous. The person is aware of having considered the evidence, of having thought it through, but that is actually predetermined by the ego's prior commitment. The thinking is the justification of the conclusion rather than the process by which the conclusion was reached. Thinking beyond personal ego means explicitly identifying before or during the analysis the positions to which your ego is committed, the outcomes you need to be true, the assessments you are invested in, the people or ideas you have staked your credibility on, and then asking honestly whether those commitments are influencing the current analysis. This is not a comfortable practice. The ego's commitments are often invisible from inside them. They feel like the conclusions of objective analysis rather than the premises that the analysis is rationalizing. The discomfort of seeing them clearly is the discomfort of recognizing that the analysis is not as objective as it felt. That recognition is not a failure. It is information. The analysis that reveals the ego's influence can be corrected. The analysis that never sees that influence is permanently contaminated by it. Removing emotional bias is the third dimension of emotional distance in practice, the ongoing effort to identify and reduce the specific distortions that emotional investment introduces into perception and analysis. The most effective approach to this is not the attempt to eliminate emotion from the analysis, which is neither possible nor desirable, since emotional input contains genuine information. It is the practice of making the emotional input explicit, naming it, examining what it might be contributing to the analysis, and then asking whether the analysis would look different from a position of lower emotional investment. The difference between your analysis and the less emotionally invested analysis is the signal of how much the emotion is contributing to the conclusion, rather than to the accuracy of the assessment. Chapter 8. Mental Frameworks. Strong minds use systems, not impulses. The impulse is the emotional system's recommendation. It arrives fast, with the quality of conviction, dressed in the feeling of obvious correctness. Under low-stress conditions, the impulse is often right. The fast system's pattern matching produces accurate outputs in familiar situations, and overriding it with deliberate analysis would waste resources without improving results. Under pressure, in novel situations, in situations where the stakes are high enough that the cost of the wrong response is significant, the impulse is unreliable. It is the output of a system that is calibrated for different conditions. And acting on an unreliable output in a high-stakes situation produces the specific, predictable failures that most people associate with poor decision-making under pressure. The alternative to the impulse is not the absence of systematic thinking, not a blank slate openness that processes every situation from scratch without any prior structure. That would be as slow and unreliable as the impulse is fast and unreliable. The alternative is a different kind of structure, the deliberate mental framework, pre-installed through practice, that gives the slow processing system a starting architecture for the analysis it needs to conduct. Decision frameworks are the structured approaches to choice that reduce the cognitive cost of deliberate analysis while maintaining its quality. A decision framework is a pre-established sequence of questions or considerations that the deliberate mind can follow through a difficult situation rather than having to construct the analytical process from scratch. Because the sequence is pre-established, because the questions are known before the situation arrives, the cognitive cost of conducting the analysis is reduced. The deliberate mind does not need to figure out how to think about the problem. It follows the path that has been prepared for it. The simplest effective decision framework under pressure asks 3 questions in sequence. What is actually happening? Not what does it feel like is happening. Not what does the activated state generate about what is happening. But what are the actual facts on the ground as best as they can be determined right now? What options are available? A deliberate enumeration, broader than the fast system's single preferred response, broader than the 2 options that urgency typically narrows to. And what does each option produce? The brief consideration of likely consequences across a slightly extended time horizon that the 3 moves ahead principle describes. This framework does not guarantee correct decisions. Nothing does. What it provides is a structured process that consistently produces better quality decisions than the unstructured impulse, at a cognitive cost that is manageable even under significant pressure. Strategic questions are the specific interrogatives that produce the most decision-relevant information in the least deliberate processing time. The questions worth asking first when the situation is demanding and the time for analysis is limited. The most valuable strategic question under pressure is the one that challenges the framing of the situation itself. Is this actually the situation, or is this my interpretation of the situation? The distinction between the facts and the narrative built around the facts is the core of the signal versus noise separation that Chapter 3 described. The strategic question makes this distinction explicit as the first step in the analysis, rather than leaving it implicit and invisible. The second most valuable strategic question addresses the time constraint that the activated state is generating. Does this actually need to be decided now? In most cases, the urgency is partially or entirely illusory. The window for action is longer than the stress response is claiming. Asking the question explicitly forces a brief evaluation of the actual time constraint rather than the felt time constraint. And the answer: this can wait 30 minutes. This can wait until tomorrow. This actually does need to be decided now, is highly relevant to how much deliberation the decision can accommodate. The third strategic question addresses the reversibility of the contemplated action. Is this reversible? Irreversible decisions warrant more deliberation than reversible ones because their margin for error is lower. Many decisions that feel decisive and final in the urgency of the moment are actually reversible or partially reversible. Making this explicit reduces the urgency pressure appropriately. Thinking models are the broader conceptual structures that organize how you think about categories of problems, above the level of specific frameworks or questions. The most useful thinking models for pressure situations share a common feature. They provide an alternative to the binary thinking that urgency produces. The activated state tends toward binary options: act or don't act, respond or withdraw, commit or retreat. Binary thinking simplifies the decision under pressure, but loses the nuance and the third and fourth options that the situation often contains. The spectrum model explicitly places the options on a continuum rather than at opposite poles. Between full commitment and full withdrawal, there are degrees of engagement. Between responding immediately and waiting indefinitely, there are timed responses. Between accepting and rejecting, there are conditional acceptances. The model's value is in making the spectrum visible, which restores the options that binary thinking had collapsed. The systems model asks about the second and third order effects of contemplated actions. How will the action affect other parts of the system? What will it produce that the immediate intention did not aim for? What unintended consequences are likely? This model counters the tunnel vision of urgency-focused analysis by requiring the wider picture consideration that strategic thinking demands. These models do not need to be consciously selected and deployed in the middle of a high-pressure situation. They need to be familiar enough from regular use in lower-pressure situations that they are available as natural orientations in the higher-pressure ones. The value of mental frameworks is not in having them. It is in having practiced them enough that using them is second nature. Chapter 9. When not acting is the smartest move. Sometimes the best strategy is to do nothing. The bias toward action is one of the most deeply embedded cognitive tendencies in most high-functioning people. The association between effectiveness and activity, between doing well and doing, is so thoroughly reinforced by most of the environments that reward performance that inaction, however deliberate and however strategically superior, tends to feel wrong. It feels like passivity, like avoidance, like the absence of the decisive engagement that the situation is demanding. This feeling is the activated state speaking. The stress response mobilizes the body for action. The mobilization produces the felt urgency of needing to do something, and the doing of something relieves the urgency in a way that not doing something does not, even when the not doing is the more intelligent choice. The strategic non-action that this chapter addresses is not the paralysis of uncertainty. It is not the avoidance of the difficult. It is the deliberate, considered recognition that in specific situations at specific times, the action that is available does not serve the goal, as well as waiting for better conditions or better information would. The non-action is active. It is the product of analysis that has concluded that action is premature. It is maintained against the pull of the activation that is pushing toward something, anything. The danger of forced action is its primary cost, the commitment to a course that was not yet optimal, made in response to urgency rather than in response to a genuine assessment that the conditions for action have arrived. Forced action is action taken because the pressure to act has become intolerable, rather than because the analysis has concluded that acting is the right move. It is the decision made to relieve the urgency feeling rather than to serve the actual goal. It is the commitment taken to demonstrate decisiveness rather than because the decision is genuinely ready to be made. The most costly forced actions are typically irreversible commitments, statements, escalations that cannot be undone. The strategic practice of distinguishing reversible from irreversible actions and applying proportionally more restraint to the irreversible ones is the direct mitigation of this cost. Reversible actions can be corrected. Irreversible ones cannot. The asymmetry between these categories justifies different urgency thresholds. Patience as intelligence is the reframe that this chapter is ultimately building toward. The recognition that patience in high-pressure situations is not a passive virtue, but an active cognitive capacity, one that requires more deliberate effort than the action it replaces. The patient person in a high-pressure situation is not doing nothing. They are containing the activation that is pushing toward forced action. They are actively maintaining the deliberate processing that the urgency is trying to override. They are holding the analytical question open. What is the right time to act? And are those conditions present yet? Against the activated state's insistence that the question is already settled. This holding is effortful. It requires the regulatory capacity that previous chapters have described building. And it is often more difficult than acting would be, precisely because acting would relieve the discomfort that the holding requires tolerating. The patient choice is the harder choice. Its superiority is strategic rather than comfortable. Waiting for the right moment is the active practice that patience requires, not passive waiting for circumstances to improve, but the deliberate identification of what conditions would make action genuinely appropriate and the continued evaluation of whether those conditions have arrived. What information am I waiting for? What change in the situation would shift the balance toward acting? What would the right moment look like? And how would I recognize it? These questions convert the ambiguous instruction to be patient into a specific analytical task. The monitoring of specific conditions against specific criteria. The waiting is purposeful. It is waiting for something identifiable rather than simply waiting because acting feels wrong. And when the conditions arrive, when the information becomes available, when the situation shifts, when the moment that was being waited for is genuinely present, the action that follows is clean. It is not burdened with the uncertainty of premature commitment. It is not competing with the better option that would have been available if only the urgency had been tolerated slightly longer. It is the action of a person who has waited until the moment was genuinely ready. That action, taken from that position, has a specific quality. It is deliberate, it is timely, and it is effective in ways that forced action rarely achieves. Chapter 10. Becoming the calmest mind in the room. The person who thinks clearly controls the situation, not controls in the sense of directing others' behavior through force or authority. Controls in the sense that matters most in genuinely complex situations. Shapes what happens through the quality of observation, analysis, and response that the situation's outcome ultimately reflects. The person thinking most clearly in a group has a disproportionate influence on the quality of the group's collective analysis, the direction of its decisions, and the accuracy of its assessment of what the situation requires. This influence is not claimed. It is not asserted through hierarchy or volume. It operates through the specific mechanisms that the preceding 9 chapters have described. The regulated presence that moderates the group's collective activation, the observation that reveals what the panicking crowd is not attending to, the deliberate quality of the responses that others orient toward when the quality of their own processing has been degraded by the pressure. The calmest mind in the room is not necessarily the most senior or the most credentialed. It is the most useful, the one whose output is most reliably aligned with what the situation actually requires, rather than with what the emotional state of the moment is demanding. Leadership through clarity is the specific form of influence that the clear-thinking person exerts, and it is worth distinguishing from the more familiar forms of leadership because its mechanism is different. Conventional leadership influence operates through explicit authority. The leader's direction is followed because the leader has the organizational position, the formal power, or the social status to make the direction carry weight. This form of leadership requires the leader to be recognized and to exercise the authority explicitly. Leadership through clarity operates without any of these prerequisites. It operates through the demonstrable quality of the clear thinker's analysis and their responses in the moments that test everyone. A person who consistently observes what others miss, who consistently asks the question that redirects the group's analysis from the noise to the signal, who consistently waits for the right moment while others are being pushed by forced urgency, this person becomes, over time, the analytical center of the group, whether or not they have any formal authority. They become this not by claiming it, but by being it. The group's collective experience of the quality of their contributions under pressure gradually creates a form of trust that authority cannot command. The trust that comes from having consistently seen better than the alternatives. Becoming the stabilizing force in a group under pressure is the expression of everything this audiobook has been building toward in the social context where it is most consequential. The stabilizing force is the person whose regulated presence provides a competing synchronization target for the nervous systems of the panicking group, who asks the strategic questions that slow the group's acceleration toward forced action, who notices the opportunity in the chaos that the group's narrowed attention has excluded, who demonstrates, through the quality of their response in each moment the pressure peaks, that a different cognitive mode is available and that it produces better results. This stabilizing function is not heroic. It is not dramatic. It does not require the visible demonstration of special capability or the assertion of special authority. It requires only the consistent practice of the capacities this audiobook has described: the pause, the observation before analysis, the signal versus noise separation, the emotional distance, the patience that resists forced action, the frameworks that give the deliberate system a structure to work within. Applied consistently in the ordinary moments of daily life, these capacities develop into the genuine baseline of the person who is reliably the calmest mind in the room. Not because they have achieved a permanent state of perfect composure, because they have built the practices that reliably return them to the deliberate mode when the pressure is pushing everyone toward the reactive one. Thinking clearly under any pressure is the ultimate expression of this development, not the absence of pressure, not immunity to the activation that pressure produces, not the aspiration of never being moved by the weight of a genuinely difficult situation. The capacity to maintain deliberate access alongside the activation, to continue the observation and the analysis even when the urgency is compelling, to produce the response the situation requires rather than the response the stress response is pushing for. Under light pressure, this capacity is available to most people with minimal practice. Under moderate pressure, it requires the basic regulation skills and the beginning of the awareness practices. Under severe pressure, the genuine crises, the high-stakes decisions with real irreversibility, the conflicts with significant consequences, the situations where most people around you have already been fully consumed by the reactive mode. It requires the full architecture that these 10 chapters have built. That architecture is now built in you, not yet to the depth that consistent practice will develop it. But the structure is present, the understanding is in place, and the practices are described with the precision that allows deliberate application. When the pressure rises, you do not react. You observe, you analyze, you choose. That is the calmest mind in the room. Closing the deliberate mind. You began this audiobook as someone who understood, at least abstractly, that thinking quality matters under pressure. You finish it as someone who understands precisely why it degrades, through what specific mechanisms it can be maintained, and what specific practices build the capacity for maintained deliberate access across the full range of conditions that pressure presents. That is a different kind of knowledge, the abstract understanding that calm thinking is better than reactive thinking is widely held and produces almost no behavioral change because it provides no operational guidance about how to get from one to the other. The precise understanding of mechanism, of what the stress response actually does to the deliberate processing system, of how emotional noise distorts perception in specific and predictable ways, of what the strategic questions and frameworks and patience practices actually look like in real situations. This understanding creates the possibility of deliberate practice, and deliberate practice creates real change. What this audiobook has built across its 10 chapters is a complete architecture. Chapter 1. Establish the foundation. That pressure degrades the specific cognitive functions that complex situations require through the specific neurological mechanism of stress response activation, shifting resources from the deliberate to the automatic processing system. That this degradation is contagious in groups through the social synchronization of nervous systems, and that the person who maintains deliberate access in this environment has a real and significant cognitive advantage over everyone whose processing has been narrowed by the activation. Chapters 2 and 3 built the first operational layer, the power of the pause that creates the space for deliberate processing to occur, and the signal versus noise separation that allows the actual situation to be distinguished from the emotional narrative the activated state generates about it. These two capacities, the pause and the separation, are the foundational tools of clear thinking under pressure. Everything else in the audiobook builds on them. Chapters 4 and 5 addressed the strategic dimension, the wider perspective of the observer who sees the situation as a pattern rather than only as an immediate event, and the calm advantage that allows the deliberate system to maintain its quality output even under the physiological conditions that the stress response creates. The strategic thinking that extends analysis across multiple moves rather than only the immediate one, and the emotional discipline that uses the emotional input as information rather than as instruction. Chapters 6 and 7 added the perceptual and psychological dimensions, the expanded attentional range of the person who is not consumed by the threat, which makes available the information that the narrowed crowd is systematically excluding, and the emotional distance that reduces the bias introduced by personal investment and ego commitment, making the analysis more accurate by making the analyst less distorted. Chapters 8 and 9 provided the structural tools, the decision frameworks and strategic questions and thinking models that give the deliberate processing system a pre-established architecture to work within under pressure rather than requiring it to construct its analytical process from scratch in the worst possible conditions, and the intelligence of non-action. The recognition that the bias toward forced response is itself a form of cognitive failure, and that patience maintained against the urgency push is often the highest expression of strategic thinking available. And Chapter 10 pointed to the destination, not the moment of perfect clarity in a single crisis, but the accumulated identity of the person who is consistently the calmest mind in the room, who leads through the quality of their analysis rather than through the force of their activation, who stabilizes groups not through instruction, but through the regulatory presence that the group's nervous systems rid and partly adopt, who sees the opportunity when the crowd sees only the threat. That identity is built in the ordinary moments, the mildly frustrating conversation where the pause is practiced, the low-stakes decision where the three-question framework is applied, the meeting where the signal versus noise question is asked quietly before any contribution is made, the situation where not acting would serve better than acting, and the discomfort of that recognition is tolerated rather than discharged through forced response. Each ordinary application is a contribution to the capacity that is available in the extraordinary ones. When the pressure rises, when the room fills with noise, when others react and the situation demands something better, you think,